The Perilous Allure of Potent Simplifications. A recent email I received from a reader encapsulates a sentiment I've been hearing more and more, a frustration the Democratic Party, a warning against the corrosive effects of division, and a plea to step back from the kind of rhetoric that fuels political antipathy. The writer, a lifelong Democrat, argued that articles like mine, indeed, all my articles, amplify the divide, further entrenching the us versus them mentality that keeps Americans at odds. They made a case for commonality, for resisting the urge to match fire with fire, and for recognizing that, despite our political affiliations, the distance between ordinary Americans is small compared to the vast chasm that separates all of us from political and media elites, while accusing my post as being nothing but self-serving. At its core, the email expressed something both urgent and paradoxical, the desire for unity in an era of profound polarization. It was not just a rebuke of the Democratic Party's failings, but a rejection of the broader political landscape, where critique too often collapses into condemnation, and where our national discourse feels less like a conversation and more like a battlefield. There is much to admire in this instinct. There is something deeply corrosive about a political culture that thrives on outrage, that sorts Americans into warring factions, and that turns every critique into a personal attack. And yet, in urging a retreat from what they saw as divisive rhetoric, the email also risked succumbing to one of the most dangerous political tendencies of our time, the seductive pull of false equivalency, the right's mastery of potent simplification. For decades, the American right has wielded potent simplifications as both a strategy and a weapon. Make America great again. Build the wealth. America first. These slogans are not just catchy, they distill complex sociopolitical anxieties into stark binaries of good versus evil, patriot versus traitor, real American versus elite. The power of these narratives lies in their immediacy. They do not ask for nuance. They do not require deliberation. They demand allegiance. This rhetorical discipline has been the right's great strength and the left's great weakness. The Democratic Party, by contrast, has struggled to offer anything nearly as emotionally resonant. It speaks in policy briefs and procedural norms, in appeals to the better angels of our nature that often fail to recognize how primal and urgent political identity has become. It asks people to think through the complexities of governance when much of the electorate simply wants clarity. And so, when the left does respond forcefully, when it calls out the Republican Party's descent into authoritarianism, when it decries the extremism that has taken hold, it is often accused of engaging in the same kind of divisive rhetoric it condemns. This is where the argument in the email, despite its good intentions, falls apart. It assumes that all polarization is equally manufactured, all critiques equally self-serving. But that is not the world we live in. The difference between division and critique. There is a crucial difference between holding power to account and sowing hatred. Criticism, particularly of institutions, parties, and public figures, is not an act of division. It is an act of democratic engagement. The problem is not that Americans are too critical of their leaders. The problem is that too many of those leaders, on both sides, but disproportionately on the right, have exploited division for their own ends. It is true that the Democratic Party has struggled. It has failed to meet the moment in ways both small and large, from messaging the steps to policy shortcomings. It has not always defended its own voters with the same fervor that Republicans defend theirs. But to suggest that this failure renders all political critique invalid is to fall into the very trap that has allowed the right's potent simplifications to flourish. It suggests that because the Democratic Party has lost its way, the greatest threat to democracy comes from those who criticize it rather than those who seek to dismantle democracy itself. To reject division is a noble goal, but to insist that all critique is divisive, that calling out political extremism is equivalent to engaging in it, is to ignore the asymmetry of the crisis we face. The right has mastered the art of potent simplification. The left cannot afford to respond with paralysis. The real divide. The most compelling part of the email was its insistence that the real divide in America is not between Democrats and Republicans, but between the political class and the rest of us. There is real wisdom in that. The interests of the media, the donor class, and the political elite do not always align with those of ordinary Americans, and too often our national conversations are shaped by those who have the most to gain from keeping us at odds. But the answer is not to retreat into a false neutrality, to insist that the only way forward is to mute our critiques in the name of unity. The answer is to be clear, sharper, and more honest about where the real dangers lie. We do not live in an era where all political divisions are manufactured. Some divisions are real, and they are worth fighting over. The question is not whether to resist them, but how. The challenge of our political moment is not simply the division itself, but the way it has been shaped and weaponized. The right has mastered the art of potent simplifications, turning legitimate concerns into battle cries, transforming complex realities into slogans that demand unwavering loyalty. The left, meanwhile, struggles to distill its own message into something equally compelling without falling into the same traps. And yet, in an environment where clarity often means oversimplification and nuance can feel like weakness, how does one push back against division without becoming part of it? A dangerous neutrality. The impulse to step away from conflict, to see all sides as equally at fault, to call for unity above all else, is understandable. It comes from a place of exhaustion, a desire to move beyond the constant churn of outrage and partisanship. But neutrality in a moment of crisis is not just inadequate, it can be dangerous. When one side embraces the politics of extremism, responding with both sides or the problem does nothing to address the actual threat. This is not about Democrat versus Republican. It is about the difference between an imperfect party struggling to govern and a party actively undermining democracy. To equate the two is to miss the forest for the trees. There is a reason the right has been so effective at pushing its narrative. It understands that people respond to simple, urgent messages. The left, by contrast, is often bogged down by its own complexity, unwilling or unable to distill its values into something just as resonant. And so, when the left does push back, when it speaks with moral clarity about the threats it sees, it is accused of being just as divisive, just as reductionist. But clarity is not the same as extremism, and calling out the right's tactics is not the same as mirroring them. Building the bridge. The reader who wrote to me is correct about one thing: the distance between everyday Americans is far smaller than the distance between us and the political class. Most people, regardless of their political affiliation, want stability, safety, and a future they can believe in. The question is how to close that gap without falling into the trap of false equivalency.